In the quiet corridors of America's most secure prisons, there exists a group of men and women whose stories rarely see the light of day. These are the prison guards who work on death row, the correctional officers who witness humanity at its most vulnerable moment, in those final hours before an execution takes place. What you're about to hear are the real accounts, the untold stories from those who stood in the shadows while the world debated justice, morality, and punishment. This is not about politics or taking sides. This is about the human experience in one of the most intense environments imaginable, where every tick of the clock carries weight that most of us will never understand. My name is Officer Thomas Richardson, and I spent 17 years working death row in a maximum security facility in Texas. When people ask me what it was like, I never know where to begin because the reality is so far removed from what you see in movies or read in books. The first thing you need to understand is that death row is not like any other part of a prison. The atmosphere is different, the rules are different, and the relationship between guards and inmates takes on a dimension that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there. These men and women on death row, they know their fate. They know the day is coming, and that knowledge changes everything about how they interact with the world. I remember my first day on death row like it was yesterday, even though it was over 2 decades ago. My supervisor, a veteran officer named Captain Williams, who had been working the unit for almost 30 years, pulled me aside before my first shift and said something I'll never forget. He told me, "Son, you're about to see humanity stripped down to its core. You're going to see men at their worst and sometimes at their best. And the hardest part of this job isn't dealing with the inmates. It's dealing with what you see in yourself when you're standing there in those final moments." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I do now. The daily routine on death row is structured with precision because structure is what keeps everyone safe and maintains order in an environment where chaos is always just beneath the surface. Wake-up calls happen at 5:30 in the morning. Breakfast is served through the slots in the cell doors at 6, and from that moment until lights out at 10 at night, every movement, every interaction, every single thing that happens is documented and follows protocol. But within that structure, there's a whole world of human interaction that the protocols don't capture. Conversations that happen through cell bars. The small kindnesses that guards show to inmates who might have done terrible things, but are still human beings counting down their final days. One of the inmates I got to know over the years was a man named Marcus. He had been on death row for 12 years by the time I started working the unit, convicted of a double murder during a robbery gone wrong. Marcus was in his late 40s, quiet, spent most of his time reading books that his sister would send him. Over the months and years, we developed what you might call a professional rapport. I would bring him his meals. We would exchange a few words. Nothing deep at first, just the basic human acknowledgement that keeps you sane in a place like that. But as time went on, especially as his execution date got closer, our conversations became more substantial. He would talk about his childhood, growing up in poverty in Detroit, how he got involved with the wrong crowd, the choices he made that led him down a path he couldn't come back from. He never made excuses for what he did. He owned it completely, and I think that's what made our interactions different from what I expected. The weight of those final days before an execution is something that settles over the entire unit, not just the inmate who's scheduled to die. Everyone feels it, the other inmates on the row, the guards, the administrative staff, even the warden. There's a protocol that kicks in 72 hours before an execution. Additional security measures, psychological evaluations, visits from spiritual advisors if the inmate requests them. The condemned inmate is moved to a special holding cell closer to the execution chamber, a cell that's monitored around the clock by multiple officers. During those final 3 days, the inmate is allowed extended visiting hours with approved family members. They can order special meals within reason, and they're given access to counseling services. As a guard working those final shifts, you become hyper-aware of everything, every sound, every movement, because you know that this person you've been guarding for years, or maybe just months, is about to cease to exist. I was assigned to Marcus's final watch, the 72-hour period before his scheduled execution. It's a rotation that every officer on death row eventually takes, but it never gets easier, no matter how many times you do it. During those 3 days, I was posted outside his holding cell for 12-hour shifts, along with another officer. We were there to ensure his safety, to prevent any suicide attempts, and to be available if he needed anything within the bounds of what was allowed. Marcus was calm during most of those final days, calmer than I expected, calmer than I would have been in his situation. He spent a lot of time writing letters, dozens of them, to his sister, to the families of his victims, to friends he had made through prison correspondence programs. He asked me once if I thought the families of the people he killed would ever read his letters, if it would make any difference to them. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that grief works in mysterious ways, and everyone processes it differently, but that writing the letters was important for him regardless of whether anyone read them. On the second day of his final watch, Marcus's sister came to visit, and I was present in the visiting area as protocol required. The visit lasted 3 hours, and I watched them hold hands through the barrier, saw them cry together, heard them reminisce about their childhood, about their mother, who had passed away 10 years earlier, about all the what-ifs and could-have-beens that haunt every person on death row. When the visit ended and I had to tell them their time was up, Marcus's sister turned to me and asked me to please take care of her brother in his final hours, to please make sure he wasn't alone, to please treat him with dignity. I promised her I would, and I meant it. The final meal is something everyone has heard about. It's become part of the cultural mythology around executions, but the reality is more subdued than people imagine. Marcus ordered fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and peach cobbler for dessert, simple comfort food that reminded him of his mother's cooking. I was there when they brought the meal to his cell at 6 p.m. on his final evening, and I watched him eat slowly, savoring every bite, not because the food was particularly special, but because he knew it was the last meal he would ever have. He offered me a piece of his cornbread, which was against protocol, but I took it anyway because in that moment the rules seemed less important than acknowledging our shared humanity. We sat in silence for a while after he finished eating, and then he started talking about his life, not about the crime or the trial or any of that, but about the good parts, the memories he wanted to hold on to in whatever time he had left. He talked about a teacher he had in 6th grade who believed in him when no one else did, about playing basketball in his neighborhood park as a kid, about the first time he fell in love when he was 17. These were the stories of a regular person, someone who could have been anyone's neighbor or friend or brother. And that's what made it so hard, because I knew that in just a few hours this person would be gone. The execution protocol begins 2 hours before the scheduled time, which in Marcus's case was midnight. At 10 p.m., the warden arrived with the execution team, a group of officers specially trained for this duty, along with the prison chaplain and a doctor. Marcus was given the opportunity to shower and was provided with clean clothes, a simple uniform that looked more like hospital scrubs than prison garb. He was remarkably composed as we walked him from the holding cell down the corridor to the execution chamber, a walk that takes less than 2 minutes, but feels like it lasts forever. The chamber itself is a clinical room with white walls, bright fluorescent lighting, and a gurney in the center with leather straps attached. There are 2 windows, one where witnesses for the state and the victims' families can observe, and another for the inmate's family and spiritual advisor if they choose to be present. Marcus's sister was there, along with the chaplain from his childhood church. On the other side of the glass were members of the victims' families and official witnesses. My role during the execution was to stand at the back of the chamber as part of the security team, to ensure nothing went wrong with the procedure, to be present as an officer of the state, carrying out the sentence imposed by the courts and the law. As Marcus was strapped to the gurney, the warden asked him if he had any final words. Marcus turned his head toward the window where his sister stood crying, and he said, "I love you. Please forgive me. I'm sorry for everything." Then he turned toward the other window, toward the families of his victims, and he said, "I know there's nothing I can say that will bring your loved ones back. I know I took something from you that can never be replaced, and I'm sorry. I truly am. I hope my death brings you some measure of peace." The warden nodded to the execution team, and the process began. First came the sedative, then the paralytic, and finally the drug that stops the heart. I watched Marcus's eyes close, watched his chest stop rising and falling, watched the doctor check for vital signs, and pronounce the time of death at 12:17 a.m. The whole process from the first injection to the declaration of death took less than 10 minutes, But those 10 minutes contained more emotional weight than I can adequately describe. After the execution, there's a debrief process where the team discusses what happened, ensures all protocols were followed, and documents everything for the official record. Then everyone disperses, heading home to their families, trying to process what they just participated in. I remember driving home that night, the sun just starting to come up, and feeling completely numb. I couldn't shake the image of Marcus's sister's face, the way she sobbed when he took his last breath, the way she pressed her hand against the glass, as if trying to reach him one more time. I thought about the victims' families too, about whether watching the execution actually gave them closure or just reopened old wounds. I thought about my own role in the process, about what it means to be a person who participates in the taking of another human life, even when it's sanctioned by law and carried out with every possible safeguard and review. Over my 17 years on death row, I was present for 23 executions, and each one affected me differently. Each one left its mark. There was James, a man who maintained his innocence until the very end, whose case raised serious questions about the quality of his legal representation and the reliability of the forensic evidence used to convict him. There was Robert, who was so mentally ill that many questioned whether he even understood why he was being executed, whose conversations sometimes made no sense, who lived in a reality that the rest of us couldn't access. There was Daniel, who had become a completely different person during his 20 years on death row, who had earned multiple degrees through correspondence programs, who mentored younger inmates and helped them turn their lives around, but whose transformation couldn't erase the horrific crimes he committed decades earlier. Each of these men had a story. Each had family members who loved them despite what they did. Each had guards like me who interacted with them daily and saw them as human beings, even while acknowledging the terrible things they had done. The question that haunts everyone who works death row is whether any of this actually serves justice, or whether it just perpetuates a cycle of pain and trauma. I can't answer that question. I don't think anyone can definitively, because it depends on your values, your beliefs about punishment and redemption, your understanding of what society owes to victims and what it owes to the accused. What I can tell you is that the experience of working death row changes you fundamentally. It makes you think deeply about life and death, about guilt and innocence, about the nature of evil and the possibility of redemption. It also creates a bond between the officers who work there, a shared understanding that we're participating in something that most of society would rather not think about too carefully, something that happens in the middle of the night, in secure facilities away from public view. The psychological toll on correctional officers who work death row is significant and often underestimated. Many of my colleagues over the years struggled with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and relationship problems stemming from the stress of the job. The prison system offered counseling services, but there was a stigma around using them, a sense among many officers that seeking help was a sign of weakness or an indication that you couldn't handle the job. I went to counseling after my 5th execution because I was having nightmares and couldn't sleep, and the therapist helped me process some of what I was feeling. But there are aspects of this work that I don't think you can ever fully process or resolve. You just learn to carry it, to compartmentalize, to find ways to keep living and functioning despite having witnessed things that most people will never see. One of the most difficult aspects of working death row is the relationship you develop with inmates over time, especially those who are on the row for many years before their execution. You see them age. You see them grapple with their fate. You have thousands of brief interactions that add up to a strange kind of intimacy. Not friendship exactly, but something more than the purely professional relationship between guard and prisoner. You learn about their families, their regrets, their hopes for whatever time they have left. You deliver news to them, good and bad, visits from loved ones or court decisions that move them closer to execution. You're present during their worst moments, during the times when the reality of their situation overwhelms them and they break down, and you're also present during moments of grace and humanity that surprise you with their depth. I remember one Christmas on death row. We had about 40 men on the unit at that time, and several of them worked together to create handmade Christmas cards for all the officers working that day. These cards were simple, made from whatever materials they could get their hands on, but they were beautiful in their sincerity. The messages inside thanked us for treating them with respect, for being professional, but also human in our interactions, for making their time on death row more bearable than it might have been. That gesture touched me more than I expected, and I still have the card that Marcus made for me that year, tucked away in a box of keepsakes from my time working corrections. The families of death row inmates are another group whose stories rarely get told, but who carry an enormous burden. These are mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, children and spouses, who love someone who has been convicted of terrible crimes, who are trying to reconcile the person they know with the person described in court documents and media reports. I interacted with many family members over the years during visiting hours and during those final days before executions, and their pain was palpable. They're grieving someone who is still alive, knowing that a specific date has been set for their loved one's death, trying to make the most of whatever time remains, while also preparing themselves for the inevitable. Some families were angry at the system, maintaining their loved one's innocence or arguing that the punishment didn't fit the crime. Others accepted the situation with a kind of sad resignation, acknowledging what their family member did while still loving them and wanting to provide support in their final days. And then there were the family members who were torn, who felt conflicted about attending the execution, about whether being present would provide closure or just create more trauma. I had countless conversations with family members in waiting areas and visiting rooms, listening to their stories, offering what small comfort I could, knowing that nothing I said would fundamentally change their situation. There's a moment that stands out to me from my last year on death row before I transferred to a different facility. An inmate named Christopher, who had been on the row for 8 years, received news that his final appeal had been denied and his execution date was set for 6 weeks out. I was the officer on duty when he received the news, and I watched him read the letter from his attorney multiple times, his hands shaking, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. After about 10 minutes, he looked up at me and asked, "What do I do now? How do I spend the next 6 weeks knowing that's all the time I have left?" I didn't have a good answer for him, because how do you advise someone in that situation? What wisdom can you possibly offer? I told him to focus on the people he loved, to say the things he needed to say, to try to find some peace with his situation even though peace might seem impossible. He nodded and thanked me, and over the next 6 weeks I watched him follow that advice as best he could. He wrote letters constantly. He had long visits with his elderly mother, who traveled from across the country to see him. He worked with the chaplain on spiritual matters, trying to prepare himself for whatever comes after death. On the day of his execution, Christopher was calm and ready. He had done the work of making peace with his fate, and while I can't say the execution was easy or good or anything positive, there was a sense that he had used his final weeks in a meaningful way. The debate about capital punishment is one that has raged in America for decades, with passionate advocates on both sides presenting compelling arguments. Those who support the death penalty point to justice for victims, deterrence of future crimes, and the concept that some acts are so heinous that the perpetrator forfeits their right to live. Those who oppose capital punishment cite the risk of executing innocent people, racial and economic disparities, and how the death penalty is applied, the lack of evidence that it deters crime more effectively than life imprisonment, and moral objections to the state taking human life. As someone who worked in the system for 17 years, who witnessed executions firsthand and knew the people being executed, I understand both perspectives, but I can't claim to have a simple answer. What I can say is that the reality of capital punishment is far more complex and nuanced than most public debate acknowledges, that there are human costs on all sides that don't fit neatly into political talking points or ideological positions. After I left death row and transferred to a minimum security facility, I had to adjust to an entirely different environment, one where inmates were preparing to re-enter society rather than preparing to die. The contrast was stark and in some ways disorienting. I found myself missing aspects of death row, which sounds strange to say, but there was a depth to the interactions there, a sense of dealing with ultimate questions and experiencing human nature in extremis that you don't find in other parts of corrections. At the same time, I was relieved to be away from the emotional weight of executions, from the final watches and the last words and the moments when life becomes death. My experience on death row taught me things about humanity that I couldn't have learned anywhere else, about the capacity for both terrible evil and profound redemption, about how people face their mortality, about the complicated nature of justice and punishment. It taught me that the men and women on death row are more than the worst thing they ever did, even while acknowledging that what they did was often truly horrific and caused immeasurable pain to innocent people. It taught me that the correctional officers who work death row are doing an incredibly difficult job that takes a real psychological toll, that they deserve more support and recognition than they typically receive. And it taught me that there are no easy answers when it comes to questions of crime and punishment, that every execution represents a failure of society in some way, even if you believe the punishment is just. The untold stories from death row are not stories of heroes and villains. They're stories of human beings in impossible situations, making choices under extraordinary circumstances, trying to find meaning or redemption or peace in the face of death. These stories deserve to be heard, not to glorify crime or minimize the suffering of victims, but to help us all grapple more honestly with what we're doing when we execute people in the name of justice. To the families of victims who find some solace in knowing the person who took their loved one has been held accountable, I understand and respect your need for justice. To the families of those executed, carrying the dual burden of grief and shame, I see your pain and your loss. To my fellow correctional officers who have stood watch during those final hours, who have participated in executions and carry that experience with them, I know what it costs you. And to anyone listening who has never thought deeply about capital punishment, who has opinions based on abstractions rather than experience, I encourage you to sit with the complexity, to resist easy answers, to recognize that there are real human beings on all sides of this issue, all deserving of dignity even in the midst of tragedy and justice. This has been Inside Death Row. Thank you for listening to these untold stories. May they challenge you, may they make you think, and may they help you see the humanity in even the darkest corners of our criminal justice system.